it was forever, you know, for him to tell me, and I'm going, what? And he goes, it's Elvis. And I knew right then and there that something horrible.
After decades, Elvis's private dressing room. For decades, Elvis Presley's private dressing room held secrets no one ever saw until now. A closer look at his mirror has revealed something surprising, something fans never noticed before. What could it be? A hidden message, a secret habit, or just a glimpse into the king's life? Join us as we uncover the mystery behind Elvis's mirror. The discovery during Graceland renovation. The restoration project at Graceland in early 2025 was the most comprehensive work that had been done on the mansion in many years. The Elvis Presley estate had decided to invest significantly in preserving the property for future generations and in addressing maintenance issues that had accumulated over decades. Parts of the mansion that had been closed to public tours since Elvis's death were being carefully restored to their original condition. The project required specialists in historic preservation who understood how to work with materials and furnishings from the 1970s without damaging their authentic character. The restoration team was led by Margaret Chen, a preservation architect who had worked on numerous historic properties throughout the American South. Margaret took her responsibility for Graceland very seriously, understanding that this was not just any historic home, but rather a place that held enormous cultural significance for millions of Elvis fans around the world. She insisted that her team document everything they did and that they treat every item in the mansion with the utmost care and respect. Elvis's private dressing room was one of the areas that required the most attention. This room had been Elvis's personal space, where he prepared for performances and appearances during the final years of his life. The room contained his clothing, his grooming items, and various personal effects that he had used daily. A massive antique mirror dominated one wall of the dressing room. The mirror was special because Elvis had purchased it himself from an antique dealer in the mid-1970s and had been very particular about having it installed in exactly the right location with proper lighting. The mirror was an impressive piece, nearly 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide, with an ornate gilded frame that dated from the early 1900s. Elvis had reportedly loved this mirror and had spent considerable time looking at himself in it as he got ready for shows or appearances. The mirror had remained exactly where Elvis had placed it for almost 50 years, through all the decades since his death. It had been cleaned regularly, but had never been removed from the wall for any kind of restoration or deep maintenance. Margaret decided that the mirror needed to come down so that specialists could properly clean the glass, restore the gilded frame, and address some water damage that had appeared on the wall behind it. The removal process required careful planning because of the mirror's size and weight. The team spent several days preparing support and protection materials to ensure that the mirror would not be damaged when it was taken off the wall. Finally, on a Tuesday morning in March, they were ready to carefully lift the mirror away from its mounting brackets. As the mirror came away from the wall, one of the workers noticed that the backing material on the rear of the mirror looked unusual. Most antique mirrors had relatively simple backing, just protective paper or thin boards covering the back of the glass. But this mirror appeared to have additional layers of material that created extra thickness in certain areas. Margaret came over to examine what the worker had noticed, and she immediately recognized that something about the backing was not typical of how antique mirrors were usually constructed. Margaret made the decision to carefully remove some of the backing material to see what was underneath. As her team worked gently to peel away layers of paper and protective fabric, they discovered that the frame itself had been modified to create a hidden space. Someone had created a shallow compartment built into the thick wooden frame, and this compartment had been carefully concealed by backing materials that had been applied to make the mirror look completely normal from the rear. When Margaret finally opened the hidden compartment, she felt her heart start racing as she realized they had found something that had been deliberately hidden for decades. Inside the space were various items wrapped in plastic and cloth to protect them from moisture and damage. Margaret immediately stopped the work and called the head of security for Graceland. She explained what they had found and said that these items needed to be examined carefully by estate officials before any decisions were made about what to do with them. The discovery was photographed exactly as it was found, before anything was touched or removed. What was hidden behind the mirror? The contents of the secret compartment were carefully removed by archivists wearing gloves and using proper preservation techniques. Each item was photographed and documented before being placed in protective containers for storage. As the items were cataloged, it became increasingly clear that Elvis had deliberately created this hiding place for things he wanted to keep completely secret from everyone around him, even the people closest to him. The first items removed were several pages of handwritten notes in Elvis's distinctive handwriting. Elvis's handwriting was well documented from autographs, letters, and other materials he had created throughout his life, and these notes were unmistakably in his hand. The notes appeared to be private thoughts and reflections that Elvis had written to himself, rather than communications intended for anyone else. The handwriting was sometimes messy and rushed, suggesting that Elvis had written these notes during moments of strong emotion or distress. The notes covered various topics that revealed Elvis's inner thoughts during what appeared to be the final year or two of his life. He wrote about feeling exhausted and trapped. He expressed frustration with the people around him, who he felt were using him for financial gain without caring about his well-being. He described physical pain and discomfort from his various health problems and from the medications he was taking. Most significantly, Elvis wrote repeatedly about feeling like he could not continue living the life he was trapped in, and about needing to find some kind of escape. Along with the handwritten notes were several photographs that had never been seen publicly. The photographs showed Elvis in casual moments, not performing or appearing publicly, but just existing in private settings. Some of the photographs showed Elvis looking tired and sad in ways that contrasted sharply with his public image. Other photographs showed locations that researchers did not immediately recognize, small towns and rural settings that might have been places Elvis visited privately without any documentation or publicity. The most disturbing discoveries were prescription bottles containing various medications. The bottles were made out to different names, none of them Elvis Presley. The names on the prescriptions included variations like John Burroughs, and several other aliases that investigators had long suspected Elvis used to obtain medications without creating records under his real name. The dates on the prescription bottles ranged from 1975 through early 1977, covering the final years of Elvis's life. The sheer number of bottles and the variety of powerful medications they had contained demonstrated the extent of Elvis's substance use in ways that were difficult to dismiss or minimize. Inside the compartment was also a small notebook, the kind of everyday pocket notebook that people used for jotting down phone numbers, addresses, and reminders. But the contents of this notebook were extraordinary. The notebook contained what appeared to be a complete false identity with a different name, a fabricated birth date that would make Elvis several years younger than he actually was, and basic biographical information that created a fictional, personal history. The notebook included notes about social security numbers and about how to obtain proper documentation for this false identity. The notebook also contained travel information and plans. There were notes about driving routes from Memphis to various small towns throughout Mississippi, Arkansas, and Tennessee. Some of these towns were circled or highlighted, suggesting they were of particular interest. There were notes about real estate prices in these areas and about how to purchase property discreetly without attracting attention. There were calculations about how much money would be needed to live comfortably in a small town for many years without working or generating income that would be reported to tax authorities. But the most shocking item in the secret compartment was a sealed envelope with "to be opened only after my death" written on the front in Elvis's handwriting. The envelope was yellowed with age, but still sealed. The archivists and officials examining the discovered items had to make a difficult decision about whether to open this envelope or whether to leave it sealed and treat it as a private communication that should be respected even decades after Elvis's death. After consultation with lawyers and with members of the Presley family, the decision was made to carefully open the envelope and to examine its contents. Inside the envelope was a letter that ran to several handwritten pages. Elvis had dated the letter May 1977, just 3 months before his official death. The letter began with Elvis explaining that he was writing this in case something happened to him and these items were ever discovered. He wanted to explain what had been going through his mind and what he had been planning during this period of his life. What followed was the most candid and disturbing window into Elvis's mental state that had ever been found. What Elvis's letter revealed. Elvis began his letter by describing the overwhelming exhaustion that had become his constant state of being by 1977. He wrote that he woke up tired every morning, despite sleeping with the help of pills. He felt tired during the day, even when he took the amphetamines and energy medications that were supposed to keep him alert and active. He felt exhausted when performing, even though being on stage had once energized and excited him. Elvis described this exhaustion as more than just physical tiredness, but rather as a deep weariness of his entire existence. He wrote about feeling trapped by fame in ways that most people could never understand. Elvis explained that he could not go anywhere or do anything without being recognized and mobbed by fans. He could not take a walk, go shopping, eat at a restaurant, or have any of the ordinary experiences that normal people took for granted. Every moment of his life was observed and documented. Every choice he made was analyzed and criticized. He felt like he was living in a prison made of fame and public attention, and there was no way to escape except through death. Elvis wrote about the financial pressures that weighed on him constantly. He explained that dozens of people depended on him for their income, including family members, household staff, musicians, bodyguards, and various others who had become part of his permanent entourage. If he stopped working and stopped earning money, all these people would lose their livelihoods. Elvis felt responsible for supporting everyone, and felt that he could never retire or reduce his workload because too many people were counting on him. This burden made him feel trapped and resentful, even though he knew the people depending on him genuinely cared about him. The letter described Elvis's relationship with medications in terms that were more honest than anything he had ever admitted while alive. He wrote that he knew he was taking too many pills and that the medications were damaging his health. But Elvis explained that he did not know how to function without the pills because his body had become dependent on them and because the medications were the only things that allowed him to keep working, despite his exhaustion and pain. He described a cycle where he needed pills to sleep, then needed different pills to wake up and function, then needed more pills to manage pain and anxiety, until he was taking dozens of pills every day just to maintain some version of normal functioning. Elvis wrote about his relationships with the people closest to him, in terms that revealed how lonely and isolated he felt despite being constantly surrounded by people. He said that he sometimes wondered if anyone really knew him or loved him for who he actually was, rather than for who they wanted him to be or for what he could give them. Elvis described feeling like he was playing the role of Elvis Presley, even in his private life, performing for the people around him and never being able to truly relax or be himself without judgment or expectations. The most disturbing section of the letter dealt with Elvis's thoughts about dying and about escaping his life. He wrote that he had been thinking about death frequently, and that sometimes dying seemed like it would be a relief from the exhaustion and the pressure and the pain. Elvis was careful to say that he was not actively planning to take his life, but he admitted that he thought about what it would be like to be dead and to be free from all his burdens. He described these thoughts as both frightening and strangely comforting. Then, Elvis wrote something that made the discovery of this letter, in 2025, into a sensation that dominated news coverage for weeks. He wrote that he had been thinking about whether there might be another kind of escape besides death. Elvis described fantasizing about disappearing and assuming a completely different identity where no one knew he was Elvis Presley. He wrote about imagining living in a small town under a false name, having a quiet, simple life without fame or pressure or constant demands. Elvis said these fantasies had become more detailed and elaborate over time, as he thought about how he might actually accomplish such a disappearance if he was brave enough or desperate enough to try it. Elvis wrote that he had been taking concrete steps to create the possibility of this kind of escape. He had researched how to establish a false identity. He had obtained documentation under a different name. He had saved money separately from his official accounts, in ways that would allow him access to funds without creating records that could be traced. He had identified locations where he might be able to settle without being recognized. Elvis described all this preparation as creating options for himself, ways he might escape if things became truly unbearable. The letter concluded with Elvis saying that he did not know if he would ever actually have the courage to disappear and fake his death. He acknowledged that doing so would hurt the people who loved him and would create enormous controversy and confusion. But Elvis said that he needed to know that escape was possible, that he had options besides continuing to live the life that was slowly destroying him. He wrote that having a plan for escape, even if he never used it, gave him some sense of control over his existence that made the daily burden slightly more bearable. Elvis ended the letter by saying that if these items were ever found after his death, people would finally understand how he had really felt during those final years and what he had been contemplating. He hoped that people would not judge him too harshly for his weakness or his desperate thoughts. He said that being Elvis Presley had brought him joy and success, but had also cost him more than most people could imagine, and that he had done his best to meet everyone's expectations, even when doing so felt impossible. The medications and false identities. The prescription bottles found in the compartment provided concrete evidence of something that had long been rumored but never definitively proven. Elvis had been systematically obtaining prescription medications under false names to hide the true extent of his substance use from anyone who might review his medical records or prescriptions. The bottles were labeled with names like John Burroughs, Jesse Garin, and several other aliases. Some of these names were variations of Elvis's stillborn twin brother's name, while others appeared to be completely invented identities. Investigators who examined the bottles noted that they came from different pharmacies across Memphis and the surrounding area. This distribution pattern suggested that Elvis and Dr. Nick had been deliberately spreading prescriptions across multiple locations to avoid any single pharmacy seeing the full scope of medications being dispensed. Each individual pharmacy would see only a small number of prescriptions that might appear reasonable for a patient being treated for various conditions. But when all the prescriptions were added together, the total amount of medications was staggering and clearly dangerous. The types of medications found in the bottles covered the full range of what Elvis had been known to abuse. There were powerful sleeping pills, including Seconal and Placidil. There were amphetamines and other stimulants that Elvis used for energy and weight loss. There were narcotic pain medications, including Demerol and Dilaudid. There were tranquilizers, including Valium and various others. The combination and quantity of these medications explained how Elvis could have been taking dozens of pills daily, while each individual pharmacy and prescription appeared relatively normal. The discovery of the prescription bottles confirmed that Dr. Nick had been directly involved in this deception by writing prescriptions in false names. This evidence supported the charges that had been brought against Dr. Nick after Elvis's death, charges that Dr. Nick had been acquitted of, but that many people had continued to believe were essentially true. The bottles provided physical proof that the prescription fraud had occurred exactly as accusers had claimed, even though the legal system had not found Dr. Nick guilty at the time. The notebook containing the false identity information was even more significant because it showed planning and preparation that went far beyond just hiding prescriptions. This was a complete alternate identity that could theoretically have been used to live as a different person. The notebook contained details about how to obtain a legitimate social security number using a false name and birth date. There were notes about documentation requirements for things like driver's licenses and bank accounts. Elvis had researched this thoroughly and had created a roadmap for becoming someone else if he chose to do so. The name Elvis had chosen for his false identity was Jonathan Warren Burroughs, with a birth date of January 16, 1943, which would have made him about 5 years younger than his real age. The notebook contained a basic biographical backstory for this identity, including information about fictional parents and a fictional place of birth in rural Tennessee. Elvis had thought through the kinds of questions someone might ask when meeting a new person, and had created plausible answers that would establish Jonathan Burroughs as a real individual with a real history. The travel plans in the notebook were detailed and specific. Elvis had mapped out driving routes that would take him from Memphis into the rural areas of northern Mississippi and southern Tennessee, regions where his accent and cultural background would not seem unusual. He had identified specific small towns that met certain criteria, including having populations under 5,000 people, being at least 2 hours away from Memphis, and having affordable real estate available. Some of these towns were circled with notes about churches that had good gospel music programs, reflecting Elvis's love of gospel that would have been important to him even in a new identity. The financial calculations in the notebook showed Elvis trying to figure out how much money he would need to live comfortably without working for the rest of his life. He had estimated expenses for housing, food, basic necessities, and medical care. Elvis calculated that he could purchase a modest home in a small town for around $20,000, and that he could live on about $15,000 per year in expenses. He estimated that with $1 million in accessible funds, he could live for decades without ever needing to earn additional income or explain where his money came from. Investigators noted that the amounts Elvis was calculating were very modest by the standards of someone who earned millions of dollars per year at the height of his career. But the calculations made sense for someone who was trying to live simply and not attract attention in a small rural community. Elvis appeared to be planning for a life that was ordinary and unremarkable, rather than continuing the luxury and excess that had characterized his existence as a superstar. The notebook also contained notes about how to handle medical care in a false identity. Elvis had written about the need to find a doctor who would treat him without asking too many questions about his medical history. He had notes about paying in cash for medical services to avoid creating insurance records or paperwork that might reveal his true identity. Elvis had clearly thought through the practical challenges of living as someone else and had tried to develop solutions for the problems he anticipated. What the discovery means. The items found behind Elvis's dressing room mirror created an immediate crisis for Graceland officials and for the estate that controlled Elvis's legacy. These discoveries challenged the accepted narrative of Elvis's death while not providing definitive proof that anything different from the official account had actually occurred. The estate had to decide what to do with these items, how to present them to the public, and whether to allow or encourage further investigation into what they might mean about Elvis's true fate. Jack Soden, the longtime director of Graceland who had managed the property for decades, called an emergency meeting of the estate's board of trustees to discuss the situation. He explained that the items found behind the mirror were authentic materials from Elvis that demonstrated Elvis had been planning or at least seriously considering the possibility of faking his death and assuming a false identity. But the items did not prove that Elvis had actually carried out these plans. They only showed that such plans had existed in Elvis's mind and that he had taken concrete steps to make them possible if he chose to proceed. The estate faced difficult questions about how to handle this information. If they revealed everything that had been found, it would create enormous controversy and would fuel conspiracy theories that Elvis had faked his death. Many people would interpret the findings as proof that Elvis was still alive somewhere, even though the evidence did not actually prove that conclusion. The estate worried that focusing attention on these conspiracy theories would overshadow Elvis's genuine musical legacy and would turn Graceland into a center for speculation and investigation rather than a celebration of Elvis's artistic contributions. But if the estate tried to hide or minimize the discoveries, they risked accusations of cover-up and of betraying the public's right to know the truth about historical materials that had been found. Word of the discovery had already spread beyond the small group of people who had been present when the mirror compartment was opened. Trying to suppress the information would be difficult and would probably fail, creating even worse publicity when the suppression was inevitably discovered and reported. Lisa Marie Presley's estate, which had inherited control of Elvis's legacy after her own death, had particular concerns about how these discoveries might affect the family's relationship with Elvis's memory. Lisa Marie had spent her life coping with questions about her father's death, and with conspiracy theorists who insisted Elvis was still alive. The items found behind the mirror would give these theories new life, and would subject the family to renewed scrutiny and speculation. But Lisa Marie's representatives also acknowledged that the discoveries were historically significant, and that hiding them would be a disservice to the truth. After extensive discussions and consultations with historians, lawyers, and public relations experts, the estate decided to make the discoveries public, while emphasizing that the materials showed what Elvis was thinking about rather than what he actually did. Graceland organized a press conference where experts presented the items that had been found and explained their historical context. The estate released carefully worded statements saying that these materials provided important insights into Elvis's mental state during the final years of his life, but that they did not change the established facts about his death on August 16, 1977. The public reaction to the discoveries was intense and divided. Many Elvis fans felt that the items found behind the mirror proved that Elvis had faked his death and was still alive somewhere. They pointed to the detailed planning in the notebook, the false identity materials, and the content of Elvis's letter as evidence that he had not just been fantasizing but had been actively preparing to disappear. These fans felt vindicated by the discoveries because they had been arguing for decades that something about Elvis's death did not add up correctly. Other people felt that the discoveries were sad evidence of how desperate and trapped Elvis had felt during his final years, but that they did not prove he had actually faked his death. They argued that having a plan or a fantasy about disappearing was very different from actually carrying out such a plan. These skeptics pointed out that no evidence had been found showing that Elvis had actually executed his escape plan, or that anyone after his official death had seen him alive and well in his false identity. Historians and Elvis scholars struggled to interpret the discoveries behind his private dressing room mirror and what they meant for understanding his life and death. The items were authentic Elvis materials, offering genuine insight into his thoughts during his final months, yet deciding whether these thoughts reflected serious plans or desperate fantasies divided experts. Some believed the materials suggested Elvis had been planning to fake his death. Others felt they showed a man trapped and depressed who never followed through on escape ideas. The discoveries sparked calls for official investigations into the circumstances of his death. Some government and law enforcement officials argued that the items raised enough questions about the official account to re-examine evidence from 1977. They noted that if Elvis had faked his death, it would involve massive fraud, including false death certificates, insurance deception, and other crimes with no statute of limitations. Other officials countered that investigating a death nearly 50 years old would be extremely difficult, and that the mirror's contents, while fascinating, did not provide probable cause for a criminal inquiry. Graceland became an even stronger pilgrimage site, with visitors eager to see the mirror and the dressing room hiding the secret compartment. The estate included the discoveries in the tour, presenting reproductions of the materials and Elvis's letters and notes. This approach acknowledged the historical significance, while clarifying that the findings did not definitively answer questions about his death. The mirror came to symbolize Elvis's complex relationship with his image. While he spent hours shaping the public Elvis, behind the mirror he hid evidence of private desperation and thoughts of escape. It became a metaphor for the gap between his public persona and private reality. Whether he acted on the escape plans remained unknown. The mirror revealed his secret thoughts and plans, but the ultimate truth of Elvis Presley's fate, whether he passed away at Graceland on August 16, 1977, or vanished, remains one of America's greatest mysteries.